I teach a Bible study on Wednesday mornings. Church is what it is for one of the assisted living homes in Milton. And there's a lady in there that's just one of my favorites. She's become one of my very favorite people. Her name is Miss Joe, and Miss Joe is blind. She suffered an optic nerve stroke, but she comes as faithfully as she possibly can. She listens, and she always wants to know what I'm preaching about next week so she can have somebody read it to her. And we were talking the other day. She'll ask me, what's so-and-so wearing, and do I look all right? You know, I can't see in the mirror, and all that kind of stuff. And I told her that. I said, it must be something. The next face you see will be Jesus. No, her face lit up. She says, you're right, preacher, you're right. Just seen Jesus. Well, in Luke chapter 23, would you turn there? Luke chapter 23. In these Sundays in March, I've been trying to get you close to the cross and let you look at the cross from the viewpoint of some of the people who were very much involved. You might call them minor characters, but they were there. And you ever wonder how other people saw all that? Here's one. His name is Barabbas. Luke 23:13. Pilate called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people and said to them, you have brought me this man as one who misleads the people, but in fact, after examining him in your presence, I have found no grounds to charge this man with these things you accuse him of. Neither has Herod, because he sent him back to us. Clearly, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will have him whipped and then release him. Then they all cried out together, take this man away, release Barabbas to us. He had been thrown into prison for rebellion that had taken place in the city and for murder. Wanting to release Jesus, Pilate addressed them again. But they kept shouting, crucify, crucify him. Third time he said to them, why? What has this man done wrong? I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore, I will have him whipped and then release him. But they kept up the pressure, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified. And their voices won out. So Pilate decided to grant their demand and release the one they were asking for, who had been thrown into prison for rebellion and murder. But he handed Jesus over to do their will. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the scriptures, for the love that you've had for us, that you've demonstrated to us time and again. Lord, bring us close to the cross this morning. We may see it up close and personal, not as some detached story which has nothing to do with our lives. Lord, bring us to the foot of the cross today. In Jesus' name I ask, amen. Picture a man sitting in a prison cell. If you've ever visited in a prison or jail or somewhere like that, you've probably done this. Picture a man sitting in a prison cell, only this one is an old stone building, cold and drafty. As a matter of fact, it's death row where this man is sitting on this particular day. Maybe he was lost in his thoughts. I don't know. You see, word was out, there will be some executions today. He knew of two of his fellow prisoners who were already condemned to die today. The Roman governor Pilate was in town this week. He often came to town, although he despised the Jews and Jerusalem. He would come to town in their big holiday celebrations just as a show of force to remind them who's in charge here. And to judge trials, he sat on the bema and he judged what was going on. He was the only one who could give a death sentence. And so he was here this particular day, this big Jewish holiday, the Passover. They've estimated that sometimes 1 million Jews crammed into that city for the Passover. Now that city could only hold about 100,000 people, but people camped everywhere. If you had an empty room, you let somebody use it without cost to them. And the place was packed, and the Roman governor Pontius Pilate was there, and word was out there were going to be crucifixions today. Pilate liked to make examples of people. He liked to remind everyone who's in charge. All over the city this particular night by sundown, there are going to be family gatherings. People have come from everywhere. Family reunions, they had them like we do at Thanksgiving and Christmas when people come together for a particular holiday. They would be having a meal, and Barabbas had been at those meals in years past. He knew the menu, lamb and unleavened bread and bitter tasting herbs and hariseth, that apple butter like with nuts in it, where you would dip the bread and dip the bitter herbs. He knew exactly what the menu would be. It was always the same menu. He knew what would happen in every home. They would go in the house and shut the doors, and they had some kid, the youngest one in the family, who was primed to ask Granddaddy, why is this day different than any other day? Why do we eat roast lamb, and what's the deal with the unleavened bread, the pizza crust like bread? I'd rather have a yeast roll, wouldn't you? And what's the deal with eating these bitter herbs, and why do we dip those herbs in the hariseth? What's different about today, Grandfather? What's going on? And Grandfather would explain. He would begin to tell him the story about what was going on. Well, we eat lamb on this particular night because a long, long time ago, when our people were captives in Egypt, God said he was going to bring us out and give us our land, and Pharaoh wouldn't let us. Pharaoh said he didn't care. He didn't know this God, and he didn't care, and he was not about to let us go anywhere. But God said finally on the 10th plague, it will be a deadly plague. People are going to die tonight, and I want you to know that in the morning Pharaoh is going to say, get out of my land and don't you ever come back. But you take a lamb, a 1-year-old lamb, pure and spotless lamb, and you shed its blood, and you smear its blood around the doorpost and across the top and down on the sides. And when I pass through there tonight, in every home where I do not see the blood, the firstborn is going to die in that home. That's why we take this. And God said, now after you've used the blood, you cook this lamb, and you roast it, and you eat every bit of it. You don't save any of it. And that's why we eat the lamb tonight, remembering the blood of the lamb. Well, why do we eat this unleavened bread, Granddaddy? What's all this big deal about? Well, we didn't have time to let the bread rise. God said, get your clothes, get your bags packed, get your walking sticks. Tomorrow we're leaving this place. We don't have time to let the bread rise, so just take some unleavened bread. Why do we eat the bitter herbs? To remind us of the bitterness of slavery. Why do we eat this apple butter nuts concoction here? Why do we eat that? To remind us that we had to make the mortar for the bricks to build the great works of Egypt. That's what we eat all this for. And he would tell the story of how God delivered the people that night, and how next morning Pharaoh drove them out. And so every home in Jerusalem that night was crowded with people. At least 10 people would be in each home, maybe more. And they would celebrate the Passover on this particular night. But Barabbas would not be eating the Passover this year. There would be an empty place at the table. He was locked up. He had been tried by Pontius Pilate. He had been convicted of murder, of insurrection, and John adds that he was a notorious prisoner and gives the idea that he was some kind of robber, some heavy-handed robber as well. Insurrection against the Romans. He had murdered people in this, and he was like a thug, a robber. He would knock you in the head for anything that you had to finance his agenda. There he was. That's why he was not going to be at the Passover table on that sundown that night. He was convicted. He was sentenced to die, and the death on a cross. My goodness, what a cruel way to die. Can't you just go and take a sword and cut the man's head off and get it over with? No, that was reserved for Romans. The Romans wanted the subdued peoples of the world to suffer. And they despised these Jews. And so they said, down here, we crucify people. We hang you up. We nail you up on a tree, on a cross, and we make you hang there for hours and hours suffering. And maybe a couple of days until you finally die. Goodness. How awful. Oh, it was a very public thing, too. It wasn't done in a secret room, in a secret chamber with nobody watching. It was always done publicly, usually at the crossroads, where great crowds of people were passing through, and they were great crowds that particular time of the year, people coming in and out of Jerusalem. And so they would go to some busy corner outside the city, and there they would crucify people. And as you walked down the road, if you had your child, and your child looked up and said, "Daddy, Mama, why is that man hanging up there? That's awful. He's screaming in pain. Look at the blood. Look, the man is suffering. Who would do this to him?" And you would get close enough and read the sign. It might say murderer. It might say robber. It might say rebel, insurrectionist. And that was an opportunity for the parents to give a lesson. You see, don't you ever do that. These Romans are watching all the time. And this could happen to you. You could be the one suffering there and dying. You know, there was a rebellion just a few years before this in a place called Sepphoris, which was not far from Nazareth. And they killed a lot of Romans, and the Romans brought the full brunt of the army there to that village and overcame it, and took every person, every male, 12 years of age and older, and built crosses and crucified every male 12 years and older. They'd go down, dig a hole, put a cross up. They'd go down just where you could see the other cross. They'd put it on. Every road and every path that went in and out of Sepphoris, there were people crucified. It was a horrible thing, and people knew about crucifixion, and nobody wanted to be crucified, but that's the way the Romans did it. So that was how all this was coming about, that there was going to be a crucifixion on this day. Now, how did Barabbas get into this kind of a mess? He was a good Jewish boy because he had a good Jewish name, Barabbas, son of the Father. If you read Matthew 27, you may even get the idea that his name was Jesus Barabbas. Some traditions tell us that. It doesn't tell us in the scriptures. But Pilate's trying to figure out what to do. He says, "What do you want me to do this one? And then what about this one you call Jesus the King?" Some people say his name might have been Jesus Barabbas, but I don't know that. He was a good Jewish boy with a good Jewish name. He had probably gone through bar mitzvah at age 12. He had learned the Torah. He was a child of the covenant. But he developed lots of anger and greed and hatred for the Romans, the occupying army. You couldn't go anywhere without seeing Roman soldiers glaring back at you with their swords by their hands and their spears in their hands and looking at you like, "Make one false move and I will kill you." You couldn't go anywhere without those Roman tax collectors being all over you. Cross a bridge, pay a tax. Come into town, pay a tax. Buy something, pay a tax. Sell something, pay a tax. Oh, they hated him, and he hated the Romans, and always threatening and always glaring at him. And lots of young Jewish men in those days joined the resistance. That's quite common in times when you have occupying armies. The resistance. One group was called zealots. Jesus called a disciple named Simon the Zealot. That means he was a member of a political party that was very active and very much wanted to overthrow and figure out how to overthrow and run the Romans out of their territory. Some of them got even more vicious. They were called the Sicarii. A Sicar was a little sharp, pointed knife. And the Sicarii would put those daggers in their cloaks, all in the folds of the cloaks. And they would walk about the busy marketplaces and streets of Jerusalem, and other places, and if they could get close to a Roman soldier or a Roman tax collector, any Roman sympathizer, they could simply be moving in that mob and take that cigar and jab him and pull it out and move right on. That would be a scream, there would be blood, but nobody saw anything. That may have been what he was, because he's a part of insurrection, Barabbas was, and murder. There were all kinds of people hoping to overthrow the Romans. And Barabbas apparently, as John calls him, was a notorious prisoner, a robber is the way he described him. And he would rob other people to finance his lifestyle. He was not some little petty thief who would steal your ID or who would take something while you weren't looking. He's the kind of guy who would walk up to you, knock you in the head, and take everything you had. He was a highway robber. Jesus talked about people like that, didn't he? A man between Jerusalem and Jericho on the Jericho Road was beaten up by robbers and left for dead. That's the kind of guy that Barabbas would have been. Cutthroat, insurrectionist, murderer. And the Romans hunted these people down, and occasionally they caught some of them and made examples out of them. They tried and convicted them, and Pilate would pass the death sentence when he would come down there. And then they would crucify them, and they would leave them on there to suffer for days, as long as they could. And then when they wouldn't even give them a decent burial. They took the body down from the cross and threw it in the city dump. You don't get a decent burial. They throw your body in the city dump. Well, Barabbas was one of those who finally got caught and convicted by Pontius Pilate and was sentenced to die. He was a notorious criminal. So that's why Barabbas is sitting in the prison cell that I described earlier. Maybe he sat there with his head in his hands that day. Life is flashing before him. With a good name like Barabbas, he'd gone to synagogue school. He'd been on the Sabbath to the synagogue. He had worshiped at the temple. He observed the holidays. He had observed many Passovers before. His mom and dad probably tried very hard. But Barabbas was a rebel. He rejected all authority. He knew more than anyone else, and he thought single-handedly he could probably overthrow the Romans, take what he wanted. And now he sits in his prison cell waiting to die. There's going to be a crucifixion today. Now he sits there and knows that the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know the heart? Who can know it? He hadn't known it. I guess he's just waiting now. He felt bad. He's cursed the guards and cursed the food and cursed his fellow prisoners, cursed his own bad luck for getting caught. I just wonder if sometimes he would sit quietly and weep alone. If he thought about his mother, my dear mother, bless her soul. She tried so hard, and now I'm a lost cause. Too late now, I'm going to die today. I wish I'd done things differently, but now I'm going to die on a cross of all things. Horrors of dying on a cross, I can hardly stand it. I wonder if he looked at his hands and thought, in a few hours, there'll be nails through my hands. I'll be hung up and stripped, and I hope my mama's not there. So as he sat and waited to die, condemned man, sitting in the fortress of Antonia, the Roman headquarters there on the north side of the temple. They're so close to the temple in the heart of the city where they could keep law and order and where they kept the prisoners. He's near the judgment hall, a place called the Pavement or Gabbatha. Stone and mosaic tile there. It really helped the acoustics there. The sound carried everywhere. It was a place of public judgment. And there was lots of noise this Friday morning, pretty early, lots of it echoing off those stone walls. Big crowd must be out there. He could hear them. You could hear them all over the city. Must be a trial this morning. You could hear somehow the voice of Pilate, and you could never mistake the voice of Pilate when he has already condemned you to death. He could hear, I'm sure, the Pilate as he's talking to this mob, and there's all kinds of screaming and yelling and demonstrations. And he couldn't make out the words of Pilate, but he could hear the sounds and the echoes. It echoed through the fortress of Antonia, right there by it. And then the loud cries of a crowd. It's about to blow up out there. It sounds like something bad is going on. The noise went on louder and louder, and suddenly he hears his name. Barabbas, Barabbas, give us Barabbas. Now that'll make you freeze, won't it? You're sitting on death row. And all of a sudden there's a huge crowd out there at the pavement. Give us Barabbas. And then the judge would quieten him down and he would say something, but I'm sure Barabbas wished he could hear it. But make no mistake about it, he was involved in something. And then the crowd roared back. You hear him very, very loud. Crucify him, crucify him. Barabbas must want to tear his hair out. Oh. No. Give us Barabbas. Crucify, crucify. Well, he's nervously pacing, I'm sure, if he hears all this, and saying, God, help me. And then down at the end of the hallway, here's a big iron door open. Clop, 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 clop. Roman hobnail sandals coming down that stone pathway. He hopes they pass by his cell, but they're not. They stop right there. Someone finds a key, opens the door, and says, okay, Barabbas, let's go. They're calling for you out there. Nothing but fear and terror. I'm about to die. I don't want to die. God save me. Soldiers snatched him up, shoved him out the cell. Go, walk. Dead man walking? Yep, there he was. So he stumbles outside into the cool April air. They lead him to the judgment hall, Gabbatha, where all this noise has been coming from. And then Governor Pilate, who is also Judge Pilate, is sitting on the bema, the judgment seat. There's another prisoner standing there too, though. Looks like he got beat up pretty badly. It's what's wrong with him. Blood everywhere, a crown of thorns on his head. He's standing there too. They stood there together. Pilate finally quieted the crowd. You know, we have a custom here. John explains this in his gospel. We have a custom here among you people that every year we Romans would release to you one prisoner you think maybe has been unjustly imprisoned. And you would like him to be set free because he is admired by some of you. And we have a custom to release to you on your holiday, this big holiday, to release one prisoner to you. Now here we have Barabbas. Barabbas is an insurrectionist. Barabbas led a rebellion right here in the middle of your city, a riot, and he killed people. And he's a notorious prisoner, a robber who would soon kill you as look at you. And over here, we have the second prisoner. His name is Jesus of Nazareth, your king. That's the reason you brought him here. We can't find anything wrong with him, but I'm going to give you the choice today, as we do every year. Which one shall I release? Barabbas or Jesus of Nazareth? Barabbas must have thought, so this is Jesus of Nazareth. I've heard of him. He's a rabbi, a miracle worker. Some say he's the Son of God. He's a pure and sinless man. And even Pilate has just said there's nothing wrong with him. We should not be holding him here. They won't choose me, Barabbas must have been thinking, right? Not going to choose me. I'm going to the cross because this man is righteous and I know what I am. And so Pilate turns to the people and says, okay, which one shall I turn loose today? And to Barabbas' shock and Pilate's, they said, release Barabbas, the murderer, the insurrectionist, the killer, the robber. Release Barabbas and crucify Jesus. That's what the crowd called for that day. Pilate didn't want to do it, but He felt like he didn't have any choice. Okay, so someone released Barabbas, take the chains off of him, and they gave him a shove and said, now get out of here. You know, Barabbas must have turned and looked at Jesus. He had to. Their eyes must have met. And Barabbas must have walked away from there thinking, this man got my cross. I was going to die today, and two of my friends. And this man, Jesus of Nazareth, is going to die in my place. Jesus of Nazareth took my cross. And so Barabbas walks into the cool spring air a free man. He might have been thinking, this has got to be a dream, this has got to be a dream. I will wake up, I'm sure, in my prison cell, but it wasn't a dream. He was free. I wonder where he went. I think about stuff. I don't know that you get into these stories of the gospel or not, but I always think about, I wonder what he did next. You ever think about what he did next? Did he go gather up the gang again and say, hey guys, we're going to reorganize the gang. We got work to do. Did he go home? Did he go see his mother? Was there a wife? Was there a child somewhere that he needed to go see? Was he going to plan his next robbery? Was he going to go and tell his friends, you won't go, what are you doing out of prison? There's this poor guy named Jesus something. And the crowd said, crucify him and let me go. Can you believe that? Poor guy, some poor guy named Jesus. Or did he follow the crowd surely at some distance out to Golgotha and watch Jesus die? Did he do something like that? Do you think he would have gone and watched it? Maybe not. Maybe so. Maybe he saw Jesus' mother standing out there, weeping, listening as they're driving the nails as they hang Jesus up. What do you think he did? Do you think he turned and thanked Jesus? You know what? I thought a lot of times about this. Most people die the way they lived. You know that? So if you're living in sin right now, in rebellion against God, it's time to take some action. Because just left to our own means, we will die the way that we lived. Very few deathbed conversions, right? You see it, the thief on the cross later on. But you don't see it because it just doesn't happen very much. People say, oh, when I get close to death, when I realize, when the doctor says you got about 1 hour, then I'm going to turn to God. No, you're not. You're going to die the way that you lived. More than likely, 99% of the time. Most people think about Jesus. They hear the story of the cross at this time of the year or some other time. They come like you will next Sunday to this musical presentation, this ministry. And you walk away and you think, well, that was nice. That was good. But you never give Jesus another thought. You don't care. Did Barabbas give Jesus a second thought? Did he live the rest of his life saying, I should have been crucified, but Jesus took my cross? Let me close with a picture. Put yourself in that dungeon on that Friday morning, hearing the crowds, knowing that Pilate is there, judge is there, judgment has come on this day. Picture yourself in the dungeon of sin, and your crimes and sins are all before you, and you realize it's all your fault. There you deserve death in the grave and hell. What if you heard a voice that said, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life? Would it make a difference? Would it change the way you think, the way that you live? Would it change your priorities if you heard something like that? I think Barabbas understood better than anyone else, first of all, that Jesus died in my place. Have you got that yet? Have you nailed that down in your life yet, that Jesus died in your place, in my place? He wasn't there because he was a sinner. Jesus died in your place. He took your sins. He was innocent. Pilate said so. Everybody knew so. Barabbas is the one who's supposed to die. Barabbas knew that Jesus was his substitute before anybody else did. He was the first man who understood what it meant for Jesus to die in your place. Barabbas had absolutely no merit at all. He was going free, and Jesus was taking his place, his sins upon him. Barabbas knew that the death of Jesus was his salvation from his own cross. Barabbas, Jesus, change places, don't they? Have you got that yet? Have you realized that you were the one who deserved the punishment that Jesus got? The judgment that Jesus got? Have you got that yet? Or is church just a little game for you? You just play a little game on Sundays. We talk about Jesus a lot in Sunday school and church. But have you got it yet? Can you put yourself in the prison of sin and face the judge who says, now it's time for you to die? But Jesus dies in your place. Have you ever got hold of that in your life? I pray that you have. And if you have today, if today is the day, today could be the day of your salvation. Today, if the Spirit calls. And we're going to give you an invitation and offer you the opportunity to come to faith in Jesus Christ today. Maybe you need a church home. Maybe this is it. You say, this church is where I want to be.